Ethical Dilemmas in Early Childhood Education, and then Applying the NACI Code of Ethics by me, Emmy Coring. Next. Oh, okay. So we're going to be working through these slides, and each slide I did 3 different ethical dilemmas, and then we're going to work through on how to handle these situations, and then using the Code of Ethics and the ideals and principles to reference in the decision-making process. So this first ethical dilemma, is based on ones that commonly happen in early childhood, ones that I've experienced in my own profession as an ECSC teacher, working also being a daycare teacher. Things like this ethical dilemma happen frequently. Specifically in this situation is that a family requests that their child doesn't participate in arts and crafts or plays in the dirt or their sand or really anything that gets them dirty. And the dilemma here is, you want to respect the family's wishes and their concerns, but then also you want to make sure that you're supporting the child's right to the developmentally appropriate practices and play and learning experiences that they're going to have when they're at school. And I think that this is a dilemma because, when family practices differ from, classroom experiences and kind of the philosophy that you build, that early childhood experiences are built around, play is essential for learning. And it's normal for families to have concerns about different activities, especially if at home, if their child isn't exposed to these types of materials or activities. It can be hard for families to open up to that because they're letting go of that control and their child is in these uncontrolled environments. Obviously controlled by the teachers and the support staff in the classroom, but not so much them because they're not there to observe. I think the first way to kind of how to handle the situation is to just approach the family with respect. And in my head, I was basing this dilemma off of a similar experience that I had with a family, multiple families actually, and just the family was Hispanic, so just in this situation, approaching that with cultural sensitivity and cultural humility and wanting to learn more about maybe why they have these beliefs and why they don't want their child to get dirty. Really trying to understand, that family's perspectives and their reasonings for why. Building that rapport, and you want to make decisions together. Even referencing these ideals and principles, we want to create and maintain a safe and healthy environment for the child so that they can thrive, and we want to create a relationship of mutual trust with the families so that we can make decisions together. And I think it would be good to share my professional experience and how maybe our program uses the Code of Ethics to outline our program's rules and regulations, and kind of teaching the families, maybe they don't have a lot of knowledge on the Code of Ethics or what are the best and developmentally appropriate practices for kids and why play is so important and exposure to different textures is so important. And in this situation specifically, you would just collaborating with them to find solutions, that probably honor the family's values, but also value the school's rules and just the experiences for that child and the child's safety and their development. And maybe that means accommodating or making modifications to some of those activities that the child engages in. Like if they're at the sensory table, maybe we try to make sure that those pieces are bigger that are in the sensory table so that the child isn't eating them, which most preschools already do that, or making sure that the paint is washable paint, or that maybe there's more supervision when the child is around sand or dirt. I think it's just important that you approach it respectfully and calmly, and you hear why the family may have these concerns, I think that that would open up the doors for them to feel more comfortable in collaborating and creating a different and creating a plan for how you want the teachers and support staff to handle situations like this in the future. And then obviously always documenting conversations and any agreements or any plans that we create so that we all can be on the same page moving forward for other situations. This next ethical dilemma is pretty similar to the first one, but in regards to like discipline and the family's issues with how the school may handle a child not listening versus maybe how they would handle it at home. And that dilemma is because you, like the first one, you want to respect the culture, their value about, and their values about child rearing, but you know, we're advocating for the child's best interest, and we want to expose them. We don't want to harm the children, and we're trying to expose them to other ways of redirection and handling, misbehavior. And it can be kind of tricky when a family's belief about discipline is different from the classroom's approach and the teacher's philosophy and the program's philosophy. But like the first dilemma, I think it's in most dilemmas like this, I feel like it's always best to approach it with a listening ear, and you're doing it respectfully, and you're not doing it without judgment. And then you just want to just make sure that we are very clear about how we do not harm children, and how we have a commitment to providing them with the best experiences. And that we acknowledge their child rearing values, and their right to make their own decisions for their child, but this is what our program follows. And just being respectful and sharing research about how doing it this way has been backed by research and shows that there's been a change in behavior and following directions or an XYZ. And I think, like the first one, using, parents are their child's first teacher. So using maybe what their knowledge of child development is and how they handle situations at home, and with our expertise in child development and referencing the research that shows what are the most effective ways for handling misbehavior or challenging behavior. You work together to find a common ground. Creating strategies together, or showing them other things that you've used in the past with other students that have worked that maybe align more with the family's values. We just want to be careful because we don't. Maybe the family at home spanks their child, or hits their hand, or puts them in timeouts, or uses the silent treatment with them, and not shaming them in those experiences and parenting methods that they have learned or have been exposed to, but just kind of saying, yeah, I understand how things can be hard, but this is what our program follows, and this is how you could maybe do this at home, like creating something that they could use at school and at home for that child, so there's consistency, and then there could be more growth. Because if there's not consistency between the home and between school, then there's not going to be any changes for the child, and it's going to be super confusing. And just trying to remind the parents that, it's like the child, we are both here for the child, and to create a safe and healthy environment for their child's social, emotional, cognitive, and physical development. And just situations like this, you just want to be careful because you always want to document that conversation, because you don't know how that family is going to go home and kind of reflect on what that conversation was, and maybe they're going to change the opinions or what you had said. It might be good to have an administrator there just so that they can also hear what might be happening. The last and third dilemma is about a colleague. The colleague acting unethically. using inappropriate discipline. And this is a dilemma because you have a loyalty to your colleague, but you also have a duty to protect children, and that's your first and number one priority being an educator, or in any profession, really. Um, and this can be very tricky, and there can be a lot of gray area with handling situations like this with a colleague, because you also have a duty and an ethical responsibility to your colleague. That's kind of outlined here in the ideals and principles, because you want to maintain a relationship of respect, trust, and confidentiality with coworkers, but we don't harm children, and they're the first in any of these decisions, and making sure that they're not being harmed or they're being hurt. And one of these principles outlines when we have concerns about the coworker's professional behavior, the first step is to always talk to them first about the issues that you might be having with whatever they're doing. And you want to be kind and respectful, and you want to do it with confidentiality so that nobody else is hearing. But in this situation, I'm referencing something that happened with something I've experienced similar, where I had a gut feeling. I saw something, I was like, oh, that makes me super uncomfortable. I don't want my colleague doing that. And I was in fear for that child. And I was like, oh, we don't harm kids. So, I think in this situation, there wasn't room for pulling that coworker aside and trying to have a respectful and confidential conversation about those behaviors that I witnessed. It was the child's safety, and I needed to make that report, and I ended up calling my supervisor and letting her know what had happened. And, I had just observed, and I documented that behavior. I wrote down the dates, I wrote down the details. Like I said, I didn't have time to address that concern specifically with my colleague, but in other situations with that same colleague, I had privately addressed situations. And I think because that had been a pattern of behavior, of inappropriate behavior, I was like, okay, this has been one too many times. I'm not going to come to you privately about this, because we're here for the children. We're not going to harm children, and we have an ethical responsibility to our communities and the society and our families and the children. And what I witnessed went against all of those things. And that's kind of what the ethical code outlines, and the ideals and principles. If that behavior continues, you need to make a report of that incident and talk to a supervisor. And that's exactly what I did. I was professional. I was confidential. I didn't connect with another coworker about the situation. I didn't connect with that specific coworker it happened with, because X, Y, and Z happened. I was like, nope, just going right to that coworker. I'm sure in other situations, other people would have responded differently. And I'm happy to hear everybody's feedback. But and like I said, above all else, we're not going to harm children, and that's how I would handle that situation. This next slide is just my reference page, and I used our book, the Code of Ethics, the outlines that were in our book. I look forward to everyone's responses and their thoughts, and how maybe I could have handled some of these situations differently, or how you would handle these situations. I look forward to all your feedback. Thanks. Bye.